Arthur is the person I am targeting. I hired the best doctor to cure his blindness and helped him walk out of the shadows. But at the moment the chandelier fell, he rushed toward the seat next to me, my father's adopted daughter. In the instant of death, the system declared my mission a failure. Restarting the mission, I ignored the task. You didn't cherish what was given to you, now you have nothing left. On my 22nd birthday, Arthur, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, smiled as he stood beside me. He raised his glass, greeting the guests with dignity and poise, his every gesture flawless. Everyone knew he was my fiancé, though we hadn't made the official announcement. A lucky man abandoned by the June family and taken in by mine, drawing envy from countless people behind our backs. And this was the result of my years of effort. Now, I was only one step away from success. At tonight's party, I planned to announce the share transfer agreement and give him part of my shares. This meant Arthur would eventually co-manage my family's business with me. It was the final move in my plan, but also a sign of my sincerity. Putting the task aside, Arthur is an incredibly talented individual and a valuable partner. That's why I hired the best doctor to treat his eyes and why I'm willing to spend more time understanding him. I looked over at Arthur, just in time to meet his gaze as he smiled slightly and said, "The host is calling you up. Go ahead." I nodded, lifting the hem of my dress and walking forward. But as I reached the stairs, something unexpected happened. A loud, cracking sound came from above. "Jocelyn! Miss Jocelyn!" Amid the chaos, I turned in confusion and saw Arthur rushing toward me. In the next second, he leapt toward the seat beside me. And I couldn't dodge in time, the falling crystal chandelier engulfing me instantly. With the deafening crash and the sound of shattering, the system's cold voice echoed. Mission failed. I left my body, standing aside, staring at the scene in silence for a long time. My fiancé had abandoned me, diving toward my father's adopted daughter, Kelly. She cried and collapsed in his arms, and he held her waist and shoulder protectively, not even sparing a glance for the fiancé beneath the falling chandelier. How ridiculous. I couldn't help but twitch my lips. Perhaps all my efforts, fussing over everything and handing over the shares, were just fodder for their sneering gossip behind my back. What happens if I fail? I asked the system. I despised being kept in the dark, but this time, I found myself strangely uninterested in finding out about them. You have one more chance to retry. Would you like to use it? The system asked. I expressionlessly replied, yes. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing on a dark, empty street. The system chimed, "Target has appeared." In a nearby alley, a young man was pinned to the ground by someone gripping his throat. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, yet calm, as if he knew resisting was pointless. Another person yanked his collar and slapped him, instantly leaving a mark on his already swollen face. Blood slowly dripped from his lips. And his head was pushed back down. This was the day I had saved Arthur. After calling the police, I ignored the system's warnings, watching coldly as Arthur was kicked and curled up, like a crumpled piece of newspaper. Only when he seemed on the brink of unconsciousness did I walk over slowly and held up my phone to show them the police dispatch screen. Stop. I've already called the police. The men stopped, glanced at me, and exchanged looks. The leader sneered first, squatting down to slap Arthur's face, his tone dripping with disdain. Arthur's a useless man, but he's lucky, he has such a beautiful woman coming to save him, ha ha ha. Hearing this, I glanced at him coolly. If you commit a crime outside, do you think Mr. Barry will cover for you? Be careful, don't leave a trail for others to find, or it won't just be your reputation on the line, it could cost you everything. His face changed. Who are you? How do you know Barry? I met his gaze and smirked. Just a concerned citizen. After saving Arthur that time, this man had targeted me, and it was after I called the police that I met Barry at the station, the same Barry who had briefly appeared at the party. Later, Barry was reported for illegal business practices and bribery. He was imprisoned, and his family's fortunes collapsed. Saying I was just a concerned citizen wasn't a lie. The man stood up and sneered at Arthur. You're lucky this time. He shot me a final cold look before leading his group away. You? It was then I noticed someone sitting in the corner, half his face hidden in shadow. Thinking back, I realized there had been someone in the corner last time as well. But I had been too focused on rushing Arthur to the hospital and had left quickly, throwing my coat at the person. I had no idea what happened to them after. I approached the figure, crouched down, and pushed aside the damp hair on his forehead to reveal his eyes. In the dim streetlight, his face became clearer, and an odd feeling suddenly crept up on me. Christ? Arthur's half-brother? To outsiders, Arthur might seem like a pitiful abandoned person, but Christ was the stereotypical rich kid, spoiled and rebellious. He was also the enemy I had always clashed with since childhood. Our rivalry probably started when I beat him up in kindergarten. After that, whether in academics, awards, or the arts, he always tried to outdo me to prove that boys were superior to girls. But Christ always played second fiddle. When we grew older, our meetings shifted from school to various parties and gatherings. By then, Arthur was always by my side. Christ still acted like a jerk toward me, but his attitude toward Arthur was less than friendly. I thought their relationship was terrible, but I didn't expect Christ to be here with Arthur. I grabbed Christ's hand. His hand was cold as ice, as if he'd been unconscious here for a while. In the next moment, Christ's fingertips twitched, and his eyes slowly opened. I took off my coat and draped it over him. What's wrong? Can't recognize me? Christ looked at me in silence, as though he hadn't heard anything. Had he been knocked out? I was about to help him up when my pant leg was suddenly tugged. It was Arthur. He was crawling toward me, using all his strength, grabbing onto my pants, as if asking me to help him. Just like back in school, when I was his crutch and his eyes, showing up just in time to catch him when he stumbled. But now I understand, he didn't see me as a benefactor, just a lifeline when he was drowning. Once on dry land, he'd discard me like a useless straw. Jocelyn, he called out weakly. I tucked my mouth into a smirk and nonchalantly kicked his hand away. Arthur looked up at me in confusion, clearly not expecting this. I disgustedly said, "What kind of filth do you think you are, touching me?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a glimpse of a white skirt by the wall and couldn't help but sneer. If you have a master, make sure you know who it is. Don't mistake me for someone else, I can't afford it. I took a cab and sent Christ to the nearest hospital for an examination. The doctor pointed at the X-ray, his tone serious. The patient's leg is severely injured and needs immediate surgery. He then scolded me, "How could you bring him in so late? If you'd waited any longer, even if the bone healed, his leg would be left permanently lame." I frowned and looked at Christ. Christ was lying on the hospital bed, his face pale, but his eyes were calm, as though it wasn't his bone that had been broken. The last time I didn't take him with me, his leg. I thought back carefully. After that, Christ really hadn't appeared much at school or in big events. But when he came up to Arthur and me at a party, I didn't notice anything unusual. Maybe someone helped him after that, I thought. Christ was pushed into the operating room, and I waited outside. Then, a soft voice suddenly called my name. "Jocelyn?" I turned to see Kelly, supporting Arthur. She had a few blood stains on her white dress, clearly from when she had brought Arthur to the hospital. At that moment, Arthur's face was ashen, and when he heard Kelly call my name, his hollow eyes looked my way before dropping again. I stared at the blood stains and couldn't help but think of the blood that had spilled under the lights. I couldn't stop myself from sneering. Damn it. When did they get together? Maybe it was after I went abroad for an exchange. Arthur used my name to fire my assistant, who then took a lot of internal company info and joined a competitor. I was furious when I found out, so he stood outside the gate all night. The next day, as I was heading to the office, Arthur followed me for a couple of steps with his head down. I grabbed his tie, forcing his head even lower. "Don't think just because I let you off easy sometimes, you can overstep your boundaries. Know your place." Arthur trembled slightly, lowering his eyes and saying, "I won't do it again." Later, I found out that the assistant had been flirting with female colleagues privately, and since the women didn't dare to speak out because of his position, Arthur had been using my name to carry out his actions. And one of those women was Kelly. "How come you're here?" Kelly's hand touched my arm, pulling me out of my thoughts. I smiled and took a step back, avoiding her touch, and replied coolly, "Miss Kelly, we're not that close, are we? There's no need for such intimacy. After all, even though she's living in my house now, she hasn't been officially adopted by my family." Kelly froze mid-motion. Okay. Her face stiffened, trying to control her awkwardness. I cast a cold glance at Arthur. Who is this? Before she could answer, I smiled and added, oh. It's Arthur. What happened to him? Is he injured too? Kelly was at a loss for words, unsure of what I was up to. She looked at Arthur. Arthur paused for a moment, then raised his head and said, yes. I pretended to be surprised. Don't tell me the person who crawled over to grab my pants just now was you? I thought it was some dirty. Since Miss Kelly saved you, you should repay her properly. Just then, the light in the operating room went out. I couldn't be bothered to look at them anymore. I have to go take care of my friend now. See you later. I turned and left, leaving Arthur and Kelly standing there. Honestly, I never thought much of Kelly. One was an only child raised to be the heir, the other was an adopted daughter, brought in after she was already an adult. No one would think the adopted daughter would get the advantages that should belong to the biological daughter, right? So I didn't care why Kelly was adopted into my family. But since she coveted what was mine, she should be prepared to face the consequences. Christ's anesthesia hadn't worn off yet, and he was still in a deep sleep. I stayed in the hospital with him until evening, waiting to ask him some questions when he woke up. Then I suddenly got a call from my father, his voice frantic. Where are you right now? My heart sank, but I kept my calm and answered, I'm at the hospital. What happened? Come back right now. Immediately. After hanging up, I glanced at Christ and decided to head back home first. When I got home, my parents were sitting in the living room waiting for me. My father glared at me as soon as I entered. What did you do today? I looked at Kelly standing to the side. She was quietly keeping her head down. I curiously asked, what did I do? How dare you ask? My father lifted his phone in front of me. Look at this. Look at what people are asking me. They're asking if my good daughter has been hanging out with older men lately. Today, they saw you busying yourself in the hospital, taking care of someone, and now they're implying you're being kept by someone. Since when did you start doing this? I didn't know my daughter was so capable, spending money on old men outside when we have more than enough at home. What will people think of us when this gets out? There were 2 pictures on his phone. One was of me pushing a stretcher out of the operating room, the other was me adjusting Christ's pillow. Neither of the photos showed his face. I didn't rush to explain, but I noticed who had sent the message. It was the project manager from a recent collaboration, and Kelly was on the liaison team. Such a petty and cheap trick. I turned to Kelly, raising an eyebrow. Miss Kelly, didn't you see me at the hospital today? Didn't you explain anything to them? My father, who didn't know about this, looked at her in surprise. Kelly, you went to the hospital today too? Are you sick? Before Kelly could even sneak a smile, the topic unexpectedly shifted to her, leaving her a little flustered. Yes. I was with a friend at the hospital. I smiled. Yeah, Christ and Arthur were both injured. Christ was more serious, so I stayed with him for the surgery. Arthur was lightly injured, and Miss Kelly came back earlier than me. My father still didn't believe it. Stop using Christ to cover for you every time you do something wrong. I shrugged. If you don't believe it, ask Miss Kelly. Under our gaze, Kelly could only nod. It's true. My father shot me a glare, then turned to her in a softer tone. Don't cover for Jocelyn. Even my mother, who had been silent, sensed something was off and asked my father. Why do you believe Kelly when she says she was with a friend at the hospital, but you don't believe Jocelyn? My father froze for a moment, then immediately said, they've thrown these photos in my face, how could I not believe it? I'm losing all my face. At that moment, I chuckled and said, anyway, the pictures don't show my face. It'll be fine once we clear it up. Since Miss Kelly's team is in talks with that person, and Kelly's a witness, why don't we let her help me explain? I walked up to Kelly and took her hand. I'm sure Miss Kelly won't refuse, will you? Kelly hadn't expected that the farce she thought she was watching would end with her cleaning up the mess. She was about to refuse when I whispered in her ear. What a childish little act. Kelly's nails instantly dug into my fingers, nearly revealing a grimace. I pulled my hand back calmly, satisfied with her reaction. A rival who's this easy to see through is boring. My father thought for a moment before decisively saying, let Kelly handle this. We can't let this spread, or it'll affect the upcoming gala. I returned to the hospital, and Christ had already woken up. He was sitting up, staring at his injured leg, seemingly lost in thought. He snapped back to reality when he saw me standing in front of him. "You're back again?" His voice was hoarse. I poured him a glass of water. "What's going on? Is getting injured really enough to make you this down?" "The doctor said as long as you recover well, you won't limp." Christ froze for a moment, then suddenly shouted, "Why didn't you say that earlier? I almost had a heart attack when I woke up." He was back to his usual carefree self. I couldn't help but roll my eyes, though I felt a bit relieved. "Now, tell me. Why were you there that day?" I sat down in the chair by his bed and looked at him. Christ took a sip of water and shrugged. "I was about to ask you that. How did you end up there?" "I was there to save you," I said, a little irritated. "Save me?" Christ sneered. "You mean save Arthur, right?" I frowned slightly. Christ snorted, then continued, not bothering to change the topic. "You know my family situation. Recently, there've been some underhanded moves. The old folks at home are all half dead, just looking to enjoy their old age, turning a blind eye to everything. It's only a matter of time before something happens. I had no choice but to step in. This time, during a project, I accidentally messed with Barry's plans, and that's when he sent his son to teach me a lesson. This was something I hadn't heard about before. I only knew that Christ was gradually gaining control of the Gu family's power. It turns out the signs of trouble had been there from the beginning. "So how does Arthur fit into all this?" I asked. "Arthur?" Christ sneered again. "He just came sniffing around. He wants to get some attention for our family by pretending he was hurt saving me." This I hadn't expected. It seemed that by saving Arthur back then, I thought I'd win his favor, but instead, I had blocked his path. I sighed. "So, what's your plan now?" Christ's eyes darkened. "First, I need to figure out how to take Barry down. If I don't, nothing I do will be free from his control." "Take down Barry?" That sounded like something I could handle. I thought for a moment, then smiled. "Leave it to me." "You? You're going to help me?" Christ raised an eyebrow. I mulled over my plan in my mind, then said indifferently, "It's not just to help you. It's to help me too." At the company's 30th anniversary party, all the big names in town were present. Even my grandfather, the former chairman who had been recovering abroad, was brought back specifically for this event. I had sent invitations to industry peers, but I didn't expect Christ to show up. What surprised me even more was that Kelly brought Arthur along. The last time Arthur had been extremely insecure, only showing up in public after I had arranged for his sight to be treated. Now, he was actually willing to come, truly a case of love conquering all. When Kelly arrived, she fluttered around like a butterfly, greeting people and acting as if she owned the place, dragging Arthur along. My father noticed and seemed pleased. Some guests even mistook her for another daughter of the family and asked my father when he had adopted her. I couldn't help but sneer inwardly, but kept my face neutral. Once Kelly and Arthur were seated, Christ couldn't resist making a jab. At a family event like this, the guest list should be vetted. You can't just let anyone in. The table was full of the city's heirs, and everyone knew Christ's infamous reputation. With the tense atmosphere between us and Arthur's identity, no one dared to speak up for a while. I was used to Christ's snide remarks, so I casually took a sip of my drink. But Kelly, hearing such direct disdain for the first time, looked stiff, though she tried to keep calm. "Arthur's my guest. Is there a problem?" Someone nearby couldn't hold back their laughter, and the room grew tense. Everyone was waiting for the two of them to embarrass themselves. I shifted my gaze to Arthur. Arthur looked pale but sighed deeply, then slowly raised his glass and said to Christ, "I don't really belong in such a setting, but thanks to Miss Kelly, I'm fortunate to be here with all of you. I hope I don't ruin the mood." He finished his drink in one gulp. Then he continued, "If I've offended Mr. Christ in any way, I apologize here." His lowly posture took everyone by surprise. I sensed something odd. This calm composure wasn't something the current Arthur could manage. I narrowed my eyes, studying him for a moment before smiling and saying to Christ, "Don't worry. Some people who shouldn't be here won't be staying for long." Arthur's face went white, and Kelly became visibly anxious. Christ let out a satisfied grunt but said nothing more. The verbal sparring between our families was about to escalate into a full-blown dispute. Sensing this, the other guests quickly shifted to lighter gossip. A little later, I got up to use the restroom. When I came out, I saw Arthur standing by a window in the hallway, without Kelly by his side. He slowly walked over to me, giving a faint smile. "I've been waiting for you." I wasn't planning to respond. He seemed disappointed, then spoke again. "My birthday is in a few days. Do you remember?" He was testing me. Arthur had been abandoned by his mother and left at his father's doorstep, so no one knew his birthday, and no one had ever wanted to celebrate it. I was the one who had chosen a date and celebrated it with him every year since. But that hadn't happened yet this year. I opened my system to check the strategy value, and I was shocked to see it had somehow jumped to 99%. So, he had really been reborn. I couldn't help but press my hand against his still healing shoulder wound. I had changed his bandages every day back then, knowing every scar intimately. Hearing his muffled groan, I smiled and said, "Illegitimate children don't get to celebrate birthdays." Arthur looked up, stunned, breath caught in his throat. "Since you've also been reborn, then watch carefully. If you don't cherish what's given to you, you'll lose everything." Arthur had missed another opportunity to please his father's family, no doubt trying to get me to fix his sight again. If I treated him, he'd have a chance to turn his life around. But now, he knew that I had developed a deep hatred for him. Without the glow I once gave him, I wondered what he'd do now. Would he try to use Kelly against me? I was curious to find out. Back at the table, Christ shot me a look. "Don't forget, he's Kelly's man now." I raised an eyebrow. "Do I need you to remind me?" He made a face. "I just want to make sure you understand." I smiled. "Don't worry, there's a show coming up." Christ raised an eyebrow, intrigued by my words. By then, the host had already started the introductions. "Next, please welcome Miss Jocelyn to the stage." I walked up to the podium and took the microphone from the host. "Thank you all for coming to tonight's event. On behalf of my family, I have a wonderful announcement to make, and I hope you all will join me in celebrating. That is, my mother has decided to adopt Miss Kelly as her goddaughter." The room erupted in murmurs. Everyone had heard rumors and gossip about my father's unspoken connection with Kelly. They didn't expect my mother to formally adopt her as a goddaughter. My father frowned from his seat. He had planned to wait until Kelly made some accomplishments before it seemed more natural to adopt her. But now, I had already said it, and there was no turning back. And that was exactly the effect I wanted. "If you want to be part of the family, you can, but it has to be done in a dramatic way, adopted in my mother's name, so the rumors will only get louder. Now, please welcome my mother and Miss Kelly to the stage." Kelly was clearly surprised by the turn of events, but her joy was quickly apparent. Entering the family was her goal, even if it was through my mother's adoption. My mother smiled as she embraced Kelly. "Kelly, from now on, we are family." Then, Christ stood up, leading the applause. "Congratulations." Soon, everyone joined in, and Kelly became the center of attention. My mother and I exchanged glances, both sharing a quiet smile. My mother wasn't just a rich wife who only recognized gold and jewels. She had turned a blind eye before, thinking Kelly wouldn't affect my position. But after my deliberate guidance, she also discovered her father's inner bias. Therefore, she agreed to my plan. After the party ended, Grandpa called me over. He gently patted my hand, not scolding me for causing trouble, but instead sighed with deep emotion. "You've suffered." My eyes instantly reddened. Grandpa was the person who loved me most, aside from my mother. Since the day I was born, there had always been voices around me lamenting the fact that I was a girl. Relatives would say, "Such a big family business, a girl can't handle it." Grandma would say, "While you're still young, hurry up and have a boy." Grandpa would say, "We'll find her a stable match later, so at least the company won't be handed off to outsiders." Even Mom said, "Girls have it too hard. I'd rather she were a boy." They thought I couldn't understand, but I knew everything. From then on, I wanted to be the best at everything. At 3, I had to be the first to finish a puzzle. At 5, I had to be the first to master math. At 7, when climbing rocks, I had to be the first to reach the top, and only compared myself to the boys. But even though I was first in everything, people would only say I was so competitive. Then they'd comfort the boys I upset by saying, "Girls are good now, but they won't be able to keep up with you in the future." Only Grandpa's gaze on me grew brighter. That evening, Grandpa called me into his study and, for the first time, patiently explained to me what a company was. The next day, Grandpa overruled everyone's objections and announced at the dinner table that I would be groomed to take over as the successor. Grandpa understood that, out of love for his daughter, depriving her of the inheritance rights was nothing more than self-deception. At the core of it was the belief that a girl's abilities could never surpass those of a boy. Since the facts had proven that I was stronger than many excellent boys, why couldn't I be the successor? With Grandpa's encouragement, I attended board meetings with him when I was 14, and at 18, I started working at the company to learn. My abilities gradually made everyone around me stop talking. And no matter what happened, Grandpa always believed in my abilities and decisions more than anyone else. Just like now, Grandpa, who had long been removed from the hustle and bustle, didn't understand why his granddaughter would make such a decision on her own. But he knew something must have been troubling me. I couldn't imagine how heartbroken he would be when he found out I had died on my 22nd birthday. That's why I would never let Grandpa's business fall into the hands of Kelly and Arthur in the future. Father wanted to groom Kelly and brought her to work by his side, but Mom stopped him. "She's my goddaughter, what does that have to do with you?" Mom transferred her from a white-collar job at the headquarters directly to a managerial position at a subsidiary. It looked like a promotion, but in reality, it was a move to suppress her. Without experience or connections, Kelly had no choice but to rely on Arthur's guidance to achieve something at the subsidiary. I wanted to see how capable they really were. However, after hearing the reports from my informants, I was deeply disappointed. I'd let her stay there for 2 months, thinking she might make some progress and be qualified to compete with me. But in the end, she was just using men to solve her problems. At the dinner table, I deliberately mentioned that I was considering a partnership with the Barry family. Seeing Kelly's thoughtful expression, I exchanged a look with Mom. Sure enough, I later received a report that Kelly had been getting close to some young master from their family. Not long after, the subsidiary and the Barry family reached a partnership, and Kelly was hailed as a hero, quickly promoted to business director. There were already rumors saying that at this rate, it was unclear who would truly call the shots in our family. I smiled faintly and instructed to handle the whistleblower issue. Just like last time, Barry was arrested for committing a crime. The subsidiary was also affected, and its stock prices dropped. Kelly, one of the main responsible parties, was immediately dismissed. I took the opportunity to push for large-scale reforms at the subsidiary. I had already noticed the huge flaws in its business model and personnel structure from the beginning, and without reform, it would be impossible to move forward. Father went abroad for a trip, and when he returned and heard about the entire matter, he immediately sent Kelly abroad to study. Then he was so furious, he collapsed and had to be hospitalized. Not long after, a post exposing a wealthy family's dirty secrets went viral across various platforms. The poster claimed to be the real daughter of the chairman of a group, and A was the child of the mistress. A had arranged for her to be tortured at a branch office, kept away from the core decision-making circle, stole her boyfriend, and took the shares that were supposed to be hers, before sending her abroad. The post didn't name anyone, but given the recent rumors, netizens quickly assumed it was targeting the Zhong family, mother and daughter. Soon, a wave of comments from self-proclaimed alumni appeared. "I don't know much, but I heard that Jay stole her boyfriend. The guy's name was A. After transferring schools, Jay kept chasing him, but he didn't agree. Then A got in a car accident and went blind, and Jay started doing all sorts of favors, giving him money. I've heard that too. And Jay seems to be a bastard too. Looks like the children of mistresses all get along well. I've never liked Jay. Does she think she's something special? So Jay is the mistress's daughter? Their family is crazy, getting rid of the legitimate daughter and making the mistress's child the heir? You're crazy, mentioning names like that. Be careful of a lawyer's warning letter." When the news reached Mom's ears, she was so furious she couldn't sleep all night. I had to keep an eye on both the company projects and internal reforms, while also overseeing the legal team to collect evidence and prepare to sue for defamation. At the same time, Christ insisted on taking me out to dinner, to thank me. I felt like either he wanted to die, or he wanted me to die. I arrived at the private room based on the address, sat down across from him, and said, "If you called me out tonight, you better have good news, or you're dead." Christ smiled but said nothing, pointing to a phone in the corner. I turned to look, and the phone screen was live streaming. As soon as I saw it, the comments section exploded. "Is this the female lead? The female lead really showed up? The streamer's got some moves." Before the female lead showed up, we were all listening to the streamer eavesdrop for several minutes. I saw that comment and made eye contact with Christ. Christ motioned for me to listen carefully to the adjacent private room. That's when I realized I could clearly hear everything through the screen. First came the sound of a woman crying. Then a man's voice comforting her, "Mary, stop crying." Oh, it was my good-for-nothing father, who should have been in the hospital. My good daughter was sent so far away. Why can't I cry? If you bring her back, I'll stop crying. Father sighed and said, "It's not that I wanted to send her away, but she made such a big mistake. I'm afraid I can't protect her if she stays here." Mary sobbed a few more times. "But you're so capable, how could you not protect her? Kelly came here all alone. With you around, I feel safe. If anything happens to her abroad, how could I live with myself? I know, we've caused you a lot of trouble, bothering you and Madam, but when Kelly comes back, we'll leave here." Father quickly interrupted, "What are you talking about? Where can you two go, orphan and widow? Just stay in that apartment. If you run out of money, just tell me." At this point, I had a premonition. I turned to Christ and asked, "What do you want to do?" "What, you're soft-hearted now?" Christ glanced at me. "Jocelyn, you're not exactly a kind person." He sneered. "That's fine, neither am I." Just then, Mom opened the private room door. I jumped to my feet, but she gently patted my shoulder and signaled for me to sit back down, indicating she understood. On the other side of the screen, the sounds of heated arguing grew louder. Mom's face was pale, but she remained calm. The livestream comments went wild. "This is intense, protect the stream. Can I even listen to this? When's the big show starting? I've got snacks ready. First time watching this kind of drama. Anything I should know? Just get ready to record the screen." After a while, my father and Mary were led into our private room by the waiter. The moment they saw us, their expressions froze. You all." My mother glared at them coldly. "What? Why are you panicking?" My father awkwardly turned his head away, while Mary put on a pitiful expression. "Madam, Mr. Lin and I were just—" "Shut up," my mother cut her off. "You have no right to speak to me." Mary flinched and shrank behind my father. My father immediately frowned. "Don't be so harsh." My mother sneered. "How considerate of you to defend her." She turned her back on him, refusing to spare him another glance. Mary opened her mouth to speak again, but my father interjected. "Mary, leave us for now." Mary hesitated but prepared to walk out. "Hold on," Christ said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Mary shouldn't leave. She's the star of the show today." My father stormed toward him, his eyes wide with fury. "This is a family matter. What does it have to do with you, an outsider?" He then turned his rage on me. "Jocelyn, was this your doing? Are you trying to tear this family apart?" I chuckled, as if hearing a ridiculous joke. "Wasn't it you who tore this family apart?" Christ's smile widened. "I'm just here for the drama." "You?" My father was seething with rage. "You all." My mother interrupted coldly. "Sit down and listen quietly, or sign the divorce papers right now." My father was instantly silenced, his imposing air gone. Reluctantly, he sat down across from us with Mary. I was curious about what Christ had conspired with my mother, behind my back. All eyes turned to Christ, who pulled a document from his bag and held it up. "This is a paternity test," he said. "The report shows that Kelly is not biologically related to you." I was momentarily stunned. I had also arranged for a test, but hadn't received the results yet. When did he manage to get this? Aside from me, no one else in the room looked surprised. My father's face even showed a hint of resignation and regret. All along, I'd assumed Kelly was my father's illegitimate child. Turns out she wasn't. She didn't even have a claim to the inheritance. How laughable. A man must be utterly devoted to care more for his mistress's daughter than his own. My father's expression turned icy as he sneered at us. Of course Kelly isn't my child. Mary and I had nothing improper going on, I never cheated. But there are things you might not know, Christ said with a smirk. My father froze momentarily, while Mary's face turned pale. Christ raised an eyebrow, his smile unwavering. From what I've learned, every time you were away on business, Mary visited a man in your neighborhood and spent the night at his place. Shortly after, Mary found out she was pregnant. This, he said, pulling out a document, is the hospital payment record from that time, complete with dates. When Mary tried to force that man to marry her by using her pregnancy as leverage, he refused. They argued, and he accidentally injured her. This, he added, presenting another file, is the police record of the incident. Her plan failed. When you returned from your trip, she tested the waters with you. After confirming you had no intention of marrying her, she quickly married a suitor who had been pursuing her for years, a man with modest assets. Throughout your relationship, Mary maintained the appearance of being single. When she broke up with you, she was already married. This, he concluded, holding up a marriage certificate, proves it. Each piece of evidence Christ presented made my father's face darker and darker with anger. Mary was trembling, her tears threatening to spill. And when Mary came to you for help, Christ continued, she claimed her husband had passed away, leaving her and Kelly destitute. In reality, her husband divorced her after discovering Kelly wasn't his child. He has since remarried. Here's the relevant court ruling. Christ slid the divorce papers toward my father with a faint smile. Would you like to take a look? My father's hand shook as he flipped through the documents, his face growing paler with each page. Meanwhile, Mary was sobbing uncontrollably. It's not true. He's lying to you. Lying? Christ shrugged. Feel free to verify everything. It's all easily traceable. As for why you never looked into it before, well, maybe you trusted your first love completely. Or perhaps you felt guilty about your current relationship? What are you trying to do? My father clutched his chest, his voice trembling. My mother hadn't spared him a glance the entire time, occasionally wiping at the corners of her eyes. Christ looked at me as if asking if I had anything to add. I stayed silent for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. Dad, are you jealous? Grandpa bypassed you to groom me instead, putting all his effort into his granddaughter rather than his son. Do you hate me for it? Is that why, no matter how capable I am, I can't earn a smile from you? Why, when I revised the company's plans, did you look at me like I was an enemy? I thought you just didn't like showing affection to your children. But that wasn't it. The day Kelly came into our home, you smiled as you hugged her and said she looked just like her mother. My father ended up in the hospital again. When he woke up to find Mary crying beside him, he slapped her across the face. When my mother heard, she simply sent him the finalized divorce papers. The live-streamed video of the incident spread like wildfire, retelling the dramatic events through every possible medium. Some viewers weren't satisfied and demanded to know about the boyfriend-stealing incident. I responded with a tweet from my official account. Just a creditor collecting debts. A few days later, Arthur had a breakdown outside my office building. I had him brought upstairs. By then, he'd lost contact with Kelly. No one was willing to bankroll him anymore. His lease was up, and he was about to be homeless. Coincidentally, the court summons for my lawsuit against him had just been delivered. That completely broke him. First, he knelt and begged me. I was wrong. I know I've wronged you. Please, forgive me. I'll repay you in my next life if you let me go this time. Just don't make me pay back the money. When I stayed unmoved, he stood up and started yelling. Why are you trying to take back what you gave me? Yeah, I used your money, but you practically shoved it into my hands. Did I beg you for it? You spent money on my eye surgery and bossed me around like a servant. Did you ever respect me? Every time you threw me a bank card, it was like tossing scraps to a beggar. Am I supposed to grovel and thank you for your charity? His words made me laugh in disbelief. I walked up to him, poked his shoulder, and shouted. So asking you to bring me tea and water is bossing you around? That card I gave you had 200,000 yuan on it. Was fetching tea and water such a humiliation? If I disrespected your dignity, you could have thrown the money back in my face and walked away with your pride intact. But no, you took my money and still wanted me to treat you as an equal. How? On what basis? Your shamelessness? Before having him dragged out, I slapped him across the face. Find a cheap place to stay and wait for the court summons. After the shareholders' meeting, part of my father's shares were transferred to my name, and I became the actual power holder of the company. Once everything settled, I arranged to meet Christ. I wanted to thank him in person and also had some questions about that day that I wanted to ask him. Christ arrived early, surprisingly dressed in formal attire. It was like the first time we had met. After I sat down, he smiled brightly and said, "Hello, Miss Jocelyn." I was about to ask him what was wrong with him now. Suddenly, a clear reminder rang out. Strategy progress 100%, congratulations on completing the strategy task. Bonus chapter, Christ's perspective. Christ had known since he was a child that Jocelyn was his nemesis. Before the age of 5, Christ had never lost. After turning 5, whenever he met Jocelyn, he could never win. Christ still remembered that day. It was during a mixed martial arts class. After knocking out his opponent, he saw the teacher lead in a girl dressed in a white dress. She stood far away, watching him compete. After he defeated the last boy, she stood in front of me, wearing protective gear. Christ warned her, "Girls can't beat boys." She adjusted her gloves. "You won't know until you try." In the end, Christ was beaten so badly that he cried and screamed that she wasn't a girl, she had to be a boy. She squatted down, her face full of disdain. "Are you stupid? My mom says girls can't turn into boys." From then on, Christ unilaterally had a grudge against Jocelyn. He swore that one day, he'd make Jocelyn cry and call him boss. But what followed was Jocelyn's complete domination in every aspect. When the 14-year-old Jocelyn was officially announced by her grandfather as the future heir, Christ found himself kneeling at home as punishment for disrupting the class. His grandfather, frustrated, poked his head, sighing deeply. "Old Jean brags about his precious granddaughter in front of me every day. Can't you give me some face, you little brat?" Christ refused to accept it. He thought, that girl, Jocelyn, wasn't a real woman, she was just a freak. But then, one day, the freak cried. Christ was terrified. He had vaguely heard rumors that Jocelyn's father hadn't taken power yet, but her grandfather had already named her as the heir. Because of this, Jocelyn's father disliked her deeply. Now that Jocelyn's grandfather had settled abroad, the whole family wanted her to work for the company, but they didn't want her to control it. Seeing her quietly standing by the window, tears streaming down her face, Christ hesitated for a long time. Finally, unable to resist, he stepped forward. Well, if you need any help, just let me know." After Jocelyn finished crying, she calmed down. She wiped her tears and said, "Relying on others is unreliable. Good things only count when you grab them with your own hands." At that moment, it was as if Christ had woken up. Everyone said Jocelyn was sharp-tongued, covered in thorns. Now he understood. This was the path a girl had to take to prove herself against all odds. She had to make her armor stronger than anyone else's. Christ placed his hand on the windowsill, feeling the wind brush against her hair, brushing over his wrist. The tickling sensation made him curl his fingers slightly. After a while, he quietly moved a little closer. He thought Jocelyn would always stay proud, trying to defeat all the men in the world, standing at the top as a queen. Until Arthur appeared, and Jocelyn's intelligence seemed to vanish. She started hanging around Arthur, spending money on him. Every time he saw this, Christ would sneer, "If you love charity so much, just donate money. Don't spread that fake kindness around school." When he saw Arthur desperately suppressing his pride to accept her gifts, Christ was even more annoyed. What's the act for? Poor and still pretending. Especially after Arthur lost his sight in a car accident, Jocelyn seemed to lose her mind, playing the role of a saint, spending both money and effort. This thrilled some of the onlookers. At this rate, the family business might even change its name. Christ was furious. Arthur, a bastard child, dirty, poor poor and blind, did he deserve to marry Jocelyn? Forget about Arthur, who else could possibly deserve her? Christ thought back to all the men who had appeared in Jocelyn's life from childhood to now. Then he froze. If he had to say one, it seemed to be himself. Yes, based on looks, family background, abilities, the time they had known each other, and the depth of their connection, it was obvious that the one most suited for Jocelyn was himself. Christ spent an entire night mentally strategizing. By morning, he made a decision. He would slowly take control of the Gu family. The first step was to launder the family's illegal income. The Gu family had built itself up through the underworld, and Christ knew it wouldn't be easy to clean up the dirty money. That day, Barry's men took him to a location and beat him unconscious. Arthur suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Then, in a daze, he heard Jocelyn's voice. Christ struggled to open his eyes, but all he saw was Jocelyn supporting Arthur as they walked away. The thunder grew louder, and soon the rain poured down in torrents. He was still sitting against the wall. His left leg was numb from the pain. It hurt so much he had to gasp for air, the rain pouring into his mouth and nose, choking him painfully. Maybe he should just give up, he thought. Christ's left leg was permanently injured. Few people knew, and even his grandfather was unaware. During the recovery period, he found out Arthur's sight had fully recovered. He didn't say anything but worked harder at his rehabilitation every day. Until one day at a gathering, he walked over to Jocelyn and Arthur without showing any sign of discomfort, hiding the cold sweat beneath his smile. That day, Jocelyn was elegantly linking arms with Arthur, gracefully socializing with the crowd. Arthur, too, had shaken off his former image, no longer timid, and now appeared just like any other wealthy heir. Meanwhile, Christ could barely walk, and rainy days caused him excruciating pain. Forget it, he thought. After Christ had thoroughly dealt with the dirty money hidden for many years, Jocelyn died on her 22nd birthday, struck by a chandelier. At first, Christ went on with his life, working normally, attending parties. He knew Jocelyn would never again appear at these events. But subconsciously, he always looked for her figure. This continued for a long time. During this period, he found the scum who had sabotaged the chandelier in order to get revenge on him and sent them to prison. After hearing their sentences, Christ spent another sleepless night holding his head. The next day, he drove his car straight into Arthur's. Strategy target has appeared. What's wrong? You don't recognize me? Christ opened his eyes, looking at the person before him. A mechanical voice sounded in his ears. Data rechecked. According to the data, strategy target changed to Christ. Christ's strategy progress is 99%. Please continue to complete the strategy task. Good luck. Strategy target generated. According to the data, strategy target is Jocelyn. Jocelyn's strategy progress is 0%. Please begin the strategy task. Good luck. Christ let out a dry laugh, suppressing the lump in his throat. She had always been winning, hadn't she? This time, shouldn't he win just once? The end.